Good morning, thank you. Yes, one person. Great. Thank you to everyone for coming today. I think this is a really good sign of how passionate we all are about the topic of international students. Thank you to our organizers. They are, as always, flawless in execution. So, and I'm sure today will be no exception. So I appreciate all of these things. My name is Michael Haan. The research that I'm going to present to you today is an amalgam of a bunch of different projects that I've worked on together with a bunch of various colleagues. And rather than run the risk of forgetting one of them, I just put everyone I know on the first slide. So if there's anyone on there that's not on there that should be, please don't hesitate to let me know. Chedley Belkoja should also be on here. There's someone named Sonia Nguyen, Elena Prokopenko. So now that I'm saying this out loud, I did miss a few people. I think my presentation will follow Angie's quite nicely because I'm going to focus on what we consider to be the three primary aspects of international students' transition into into the Canadian ecosphere. First one is I'll talk a little bit about the data, but I won't bore you with that for too long. Then I'll move on to talk almost immediately about attraction. And then we're going to look at transition rates and then subsequent retention because, as everybody probably knows, many provinces increasingly see tertiary education, post-secondary education as part of their population and economic growth engines. So it becomes increasingly important to understand who makes the transition and whether or not they stick around in their jurisdiction of study. So first, recruitment. This is, of the three, this is probably the easiest one to measure because it is clearly demarcated by an individual coming to Canada on a study permit. IRCC issues the study visas. They keep very good records about who these people are, where they're coming from, where their intended province of study is, etc. So this was relatively easy to study, but even despite that, we had to make a couple of choices when we presented when I show you the next table of numbers. We don't care about whether or not anybody not for this slide. We don't care whether or not people finish their study or not. All that we're interested in is that they enter Canada on a study visa. We don't necessarily, not for this anyway, we don't look at what happens on the other side. We don't, for recruitment, we don't identify or distinguish between people that make the transition to permanency. We don't look at whether or not they subsequently hold other temporary permits. And in a few slides, I'm going to show you how circuitous the route is for some international students to gain permanent residency in Canada. And then finally, because we're using administrative tax records linked to administrative study permits and administrative landing records, for the first slide for recruitment, we're not going to identify whether or not an individual could be linked to their tax records. Okay, so hopefully that's enough qualifiers. These numbers come directly from IRCC, and I apologize that the font is so small. Luckily, we have a large screen, but you can see, as Angie mentioned, we see quite a bit of significant increase over time in terms of the number of people that show up. So you might be used to seeing numbers that are as high as 450,000. That denotes the stock of international students that are in Canada at any one point in time. This table denotes the number of unique new permits that are issued to individuals. So in 2015, we saw 221,000 people come into Canada, and you can look quickly, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because I understand that slides will be made available, and this is also available on IRCC's website, but you can see the distribution across the provinces and how some provinces have really kind of gotten on the bandwagon of international student recruitment, whereas others are perhaps following behind a little bit. So you can see the increase for now. Probably the least interesting, or competing for the least interesting slide in the presentation, are the socio-demographic characteristics of international students. Angie presented some of this already, but relatively similar looking population to what you have in Canada overall with the students. We have a relatively equitable distribution of men and women, although we can see that the proportion of males is inching up over time, and perhaps this has to do with males coming for male-dominated fields of study. I don't know. The distribution of age, students tend to be young. Well, we already knew that. And as Angie noted already, a lot of people are coming here to take advantage of our really strong post-secondary education institutions. So those are the people often that we talk about when we think about international students. And there's some reason for that because they do form the bulk of the population. So that's it for recruitment. Canada recruits a lot, as Angie denoted. We're in the top 10. The questions that I'm more interested in, and they're a little more data intensive, is identifying the proportion of people that subsequently make the transition to permanent status and whether they stay in their province of study. So to measure transitions, and this is where it gets to be a little bit more complicated, you have this overall idea that, it's very simple to identify when somebody makes the transition from temporary status as an international student to permanent resident. But it actually becomes pretty complicated because there are, as I mentioned, all sorts of different sequences that individuals can pursue. Often a student will come in on a particular study permit. It won't turn into a longer term opportunity in Canada. They'll go back to their home country, realize that they want to come back here, so they'll bounce back and forth a few times. Linking all of these people together and trying to identify that and ensure that it's actually the same person becomes complicated. Thankfully, there are a lot of smart people in Ottawa working at Statistics Canada who specialize in these types of things, so they do a lot of the work for us, because I think without them, this presentation would have a lot more gaps. So what I do, what we do in the next slide is we look at the extent to which people make the transition from temporary status as an international student to permanent resident. So my colleague at StatCan, Feng Hao, made this table, and what it denotes is the transition rates by study cohort. So on the bottom left, we have the longest blue line, because we can identify people that were here between 1990 to 1994, and we can measure over time and look at the extent to which people make the transition. So clearly, if an individual is going to switch to a permanent resident, it's likely to happen in the first 6 or 7 years. For subsequent cohorts, you sort of see a similar pathway, although overall you see a decline in the transition rates. But this probably isn't in my interpretation, is that this probably is not a cause for concern. All it reflects is that we're recruiting far more international students to come to Canada, and although many do have the plan, the longer-term plan of transitioning to permanent status, many don't. So countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, have transition rates that are almost nil. And when we have students coming in from those countries, they're going to push down our transition rates, not necessarily in a troubling way. Okay, so one of the things that you see, decline across cohorts to some extent, but not a cause for concern because the numbers are going up so quickly. At least this is my interpretation. Perhaps we can discuss this later. So I mentioned earlier that there's a really interesting analysis to be done out there in the wild about what sorts of pathways individuals pursue when they're moving on to and trying to become permanent residents in Canada. So what I had my postdoc do is just take a look at the number of permits that individuals are holding and create sequences. We call it sequence analysis, and just calculate the proportion of people that follow certain sequences. So along the top, we have 39% of all people who came to Canada and became a permanent resident after holding only one permit. So less than half came to Canada on a study permit, held only one permit, moved on to permanent status. It could be a postgraduate work permit. There are all sorts of temporary permits. There are all sorts of temporary permits that they could have held, but didn't. They moved right into permanent status. Second, lots of people, and this is increasingly, I think, becoming true, people make the transition where they simultaneously hold a study permit and a work permit, whether it be a postgraduate work permit or some other valid work permit that allows them to be on Canadian soil and to hold a full-time position. So the second group, 28%, they started off as students only, then they held this hybrid dual permit status of study work, and then they finally made the transition to having just a work permit. So their study permit expired, and then they moved on to hold just a work permit. And these are the two largest groups. I won't bore you or belabor the details of some of the other transitions, but you kind of understand how the distribution of population works according to permit status and permit pathway. Again, Angie mentioned this as well, but thankfully she didn't present too much detail about this so that I can have some sort of new news for you. People who come, they follow a bunch of different pathways, and they land under different admission categories. The dominant one, at least in the past, 47.7%, people come under the economic class. And this is a broad grouping that contains almost countless different streams whereby people can come, but we rolled them all up and called them economic applicants, and these are the principal applicants that come in. So 47% of the population. Behind them are their spouses and dependents. So this suggests that it's not necessarily just an individual that's coming to study in Canada, it's also families. And sometimes both spouses will be working. So this is something that I think we need to think about it a little bit, because it's not just an individual atomic student bouncing around on their own. We have not insignificant numbers of refugees coming. We have not insignificant numbers of people arriving under the family class. So although there are pathways that IRCC is facilitating for direct entry into Canada, these are not the only ones. Okay, I have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to hopefully speed up a little bit, because I think this is the most interesting part of the presentation. Retention. How do you define retention? Well, there are at least two different categories, and if you're in a province struggling with demographic decline, provincial retention may actually be more important to you than national retention. Even though immigration is federal jurisdiction, provinces really have a stake in this. Municipalities, universities, colleges, everybody has a stake in this. So to some extent, if you look at the national retention rates, you can say, okay, well, that was successful. We brought a student to Canada, they're contributing to the they're contributing to the economy, they're helping with our population problem. All of these good things are happening. But provinces don't necessarily see it the same way, because they want to ensure that their education dollars that are invested in international students will be actualized locally in terms of productivity and labor market participation. So, all this to say, there's a national retention component that people are interested in for good reason, but also there's a provincial component that people should be interested in for a good reason. And as I mentioned, these are tax files. So we measure national and provincial retention by looking at an individual that lands in Canada, and then on your T1 tax files in subsequent years, you're required to put down your 6-digit postal code. From that 6-digit postal code, we can identify where exactly a person is living. I mean, it might sound a little creepy, but this is kind of the thing that government is doing now. They're bringing together all of these administrative data files to allow us to answer questions that we would not have been able to in the past. So here's a fictitious province. I've named it creatively. I've named it X, and it shows the 4 different categories of interest, or what I think are of interest, in terms of what we can do to the international student population to learn more about them. So the first column, these are the people that we never find another permit for, whether it's or a tax file for. So they're not in the permanent resident file. They're not in the tax files. So here, this number's not out of line. So it's 67%. The second group are people who have landed in Canada, but on their landing record, they say, we are leaving our province of study. So right away, they're saying, I'm out of here, I'm going to wherever it is. I mean, Toronto would probably surface as a common destination for these folks. And that could be defined as a successful national retention, but a failed provincial retention, because they say, I'm leaving right away. The last 2 columns, individuals say that they're staying in their province of study, and then the first group are subsequently found in a tax return outside of their province of study. So they say they're going to stay in Manitoba, but lo and behold, we find them in Saskatchewan. Okay? And then finally, this last group are the people that stayed in their province of study. So they received a diploma or degree, made the transition to permanent status, and among them, we find them in the tax files later. Okay? So 4 things, all pointing to different pieces of information. I wanted to lay them out now, because in the next slide I'm going to hit you with a wall of numbers where I present these 4 numbers for all provinces. Okay? Everyone ready? I apologize for this. I know I'm violating some of the etiquette of presentations, but this is a wall of numbers, and I didn't know how else to present it. I actually had it on 2 different slides, but I figured that's not really accomplishing much, because it's the same number of numbers. It's just that you're spreading them out over 2 slides. So I went back to Plan A, where we have those 4 columns by province. Okay, so let's just quickly look at the top one. Actually, we're in British Columbia. Let's talk about British Columbia. So 73.4% of all students in BC left after their studies were completed. Or we don't know if they were completed. They left and did not subsequently pursue another permit. Of the people that did land in Canada, it's a very impressive number, very impressively small number, that are subsequently found filing taxes elsewhere. So 4.6 said on their landing records that they're leaving British Columbia. Another 0.7% said, no, I'm going to stay in BC, but we found them elsewhere filing taxes in any other province in Canada. And then finally, on the very end, is a really interesting number. About 1 in 5 of all people, of people that study in BC, are subsequently found filing taxes here. So we don't know if they're doing well from this table. We don't know if they're succeeding gloriously, but we know they're here. We know they're filing taxes. So an obvious follow-up question would be to say, how are these people doing? And I think Vicki might talk a little bit about some of that. Okay, so I know that my time is limited, but there's a lot of information here, and if you're interested in international student recruitment retention, this is a pretty good slide to consult because it gives you an overview of how each and every province is doing. Okay, so the next one, this comes from a study that Vicki Chedley-Belkoja and Sonia Nguyen and I did. It looks at differences across source country, but only for Atlantic Canada. And the reason it's only Atlantic Canada is because that's who is funding us. So it's the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. They said, we want to know what happens with international students in Atlantic Canada, so let's take a look. We want to know the differences by source region. So this is Atlantic Canada, and results for other provinces do look quite different. Okay, just to warn you. But this gives you an idea of the variation that exists across source countries. So I mentioned Saudi Arabia. Where is it? I mentioned Saudi Arabia not that long ago as being a country where, almost everybody goes back to Saudi Arabia. And there's a scholarship program meant to support this. The visa program is meant to support this in Saudi Arabia, but it really seems to be working. 99.4% of all people are not found having a study permit or filing taxes. Of the remaining 0.6%, 1.1% it heads outside a province of study, and then we have 0% that actually file outside, and then 0.5% of all people are filing in their province of study. Very small numbers. Compare that to something like let's go for the top, students from China, where you have about 4/5 of all people going back, another 6% leaving their province of study in Atlantic Canada, probably heading westward. Another 0.5% that are found filing taxes outside of the province of study. And then finally, 14.4% are found filing taxes in either their year of landing or the year after they land in an Atlantic Canadian province. So the provinces, the Atlantic provinces are really excited about this. I just got the 2-minute warning. The Atlantic Canadian provinces are really excited about these numbers because what it suggests to them is that by increasing the numbers of students that come in, that 14.4%, for example, even if it holds steady, will increase the numbers significantly. And of course, Atlantic Canada, through things like the Atlantic Immigration Pilot Program, are trying to actually increase that transition rate and retention rate. Finally, because I know I don't have much time left, 5-year retention rates for everyone. Now we're back to all of Canada, okay? So what we have, because I'm showing you by province. So what we have is what proportion of people that land in Canada are subsequently found filing taxes in their province of study 5 years later. Because as everybody who studies immigration knows, immigrants in their first few years, both before landing and after landing, move around a lot. So this number is impactful because what it shows is which provinces are doing the best job at longer or medium-term retention. So not surprisingly, the usual suspects emerge. We have Alberta, BC, Ontario at the top, and then we have smaller jurisdictions like PEI. Where's New Brunswick? It'll be low. I have PEI twice, sorry about that. Newfoundland, half. New Brunswick, just over half. So the retention rates are quite a bit lower. But this is interesting because what it shows is that all these, and what we haven't looked at is the extent to which people are moving around based on economic opportunities. So are people that leave some of these smaller jurisdictions and head to larger jurisdictions doing so because they're not doing well economically? Or is there a longer-term conscientious strategy where somebody has always had in their head they wanted to live in Vancouver, for example, and what they did was they used the education platform to get them there? We don't know the difference. We don't know, at least I don't know yet. I think I'm even on time. Yes, I am. Great. Thank you.